Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Singer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of the nudges or committee chair people of the Chicago Museum Exhibitors Group. I'm also an exhibit developer at Lucy Creative, and I wanted to welcome you all to this webinar. Just to start with a couple of announcements. We have some new guidelines for solicitations. In short, if you're a vendor, this is not the venue to promote yourself. And we'll post a link in the chat, I think Kristen just did, with more details to those guidelines. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity for live captions, but we're going to be posting this video on YouTube, and there will be captions there. And I also want to take a pause and do a land acknowledgement, because it is not the responsibility of people who have been made invisible to remind us that they are here. So Chicago is within the ancestral homeland of the Council of Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations. And the Chicagoland area is also currently home to a large, flourishing urban indigenous population. And I'm just going to pop in the chat a great video about some initiatives by Chicago Native youth that you can take a look at as your time allows. And so now we're going to move into the event itself. So a few months ago, the Chicago Museum Exhibitors Group was thinking about how to respond to what's happening in our society right now in terms of racial justice. And we wanted to think about ways to use our platform to not just make statements, but to take action. So one thing we're doing to really just kick this off is this event. And after this event, we are going to be starting a diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion committee that will be examining how CMEG as an organization and our members can better support diversity, accessibility, inclusion, and equity in CMEG specifically, as well as in museums across the Chicagoland area. And I can post the sign up link for that committee in the chat if you want to be a part of that. And so this is a pretty big topic. We're obviously not going to be able to cover everything about DEAI in this 1 hour. We're just going to have a conversation, and we're hoping the conversation will continue as part of this committee. So I hope you'll join some of us for that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists. And we have Alex Pafilis, who is an early childhood educator and a DEAI consultant. And she has a relentless commitment to anti-racist advocacy, activism, and all things involving joyful play and learning. We are also joined by Sara Phalen, who is the director of the West Chicago City Museum and the Warrenville Historical Museum and Art Gallery, which is a small museum. And she is an advocate for small museums and helping them work towards equity in local history initiatives. And last but certainly not least, we have Therese Quinn, who is an associate professor and director of the Museum and Exhibition Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And she has worked as an exhibit researcher, developer, and evaluator for the Field Museum, the Chicago Children's Museum, the California Academy of Sciences, and a lot more. And to kick off, I would like to ask the speakers to tell us a little bit about what identities they're bringing to this conversation, and how do your identities inform your perspective on these issues? Therese,
all right, I'll jump in. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. It was so crazy to see the numbers getting bigger, but for all the guests. So I really want to thank CMEG for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I guess, you know, that was an interesting question that you posed for us earlier, and I really did reflect on that. So I think some of the obvious things about me are that I'm a white or European American woman. I'm a cisgender, yet also queer person. And I have an identity that stems out of a kind of a working class upbringing to a kind of solidly middle class to maybe even upper middle class kind of existence now. And I think all those things factor into how my identity shapes what I do in relationship to museums and cultural institutions.
And yes, I will echo what Therese said. Very happy to be here and helping CMEG get this conversation started. Also, perhaps looking at me, you might recognize that I'm a Mexican American. I am also cisgender, heterosexual, and do recognize my privilege, though, as Therese said, for those of us in the field or who live more comfortably, which I think this pandemic has allowed us to really reflect upon. Those of us that also are in jobs where we can work from home, you know, many different levels of privilege that we all face. I will also reflect that I'm also of a mixed identity. So my mother is white and my father is Mexican. And I think that balancing that I've done in my personal life throughout my entire life has also really influenced the way that I balance the different identities and the different discussions, especially when it speaks to these really hard issues of racism and injustices within our field, how we also play those out in our personal lives every day.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful question. And I am so pleased to be here with these other experts in the field that have been doing this work a lot longer than I have. And it is a privilege in itself to be a part of such a group as well. So my pronouns are she, her, friend. I am heterosexual. I am a mother. I am an educator. My identity is really guided by my ethnicities. I'm Puerto Rican and Greek. I grew up in Puerto Rico. So I have that lens of coming from a place that's still a colony to the United States. And having the experience of coming here, I compare it a bit to my own father, who's an immigrant, a Greek immigrant, and how the things that he went through is very similar to the things that I have gone through when I moved to the mainland, I suppose. Puerto Rico is the motherland, but this is the mainland, right? And so that is always the first thing I think about when anybody asks about my identity. It really goes to the culture and ethnicity aspects. I'm married. My husband is Jewish, and I have a son who's 14. So that also plays into now.
I think we have a little freeze from Alex. So I'm going to continue on to the next question, and hopefully we can get Alex back with us. Are there any experiences that any of you have had where you have found your personal identity really informs work you're doing with a museum, or you found that it like brushes up against something that the museum is trying to do?
I will say for those of you who aren't familiar with West Chicago, we're in the western suburbs, about 30 miles west of Chicago, just in between Wheaton and St. Charles. But our population is very diverse. So by the 2010 census, we were 51% Latinx, mostly Mexican Americans. So the dividing line that I walk in my personal life, it also exists in our community, which sometimes can be very divided on white and brown. When I came to this museum in 2006, which seems like eons ago, we were first starting to put Spanish labels that was becoming the norm for our exhibit. And to think of the controversy that we had with that project, just to introduce something that we knew our population needed to make it more accessible. But also when we started to expand our programming to include more brown voices, because depending on the day or the context people find me in, I can present white. So what people will say to a museum worker without knowing their ethnicity and without knowing their background can be rather jarring, the racism. And I think that's really informed this work for me as we push the boundaries on justice in our institution to really make sure that we're protecting our frontline staff as we undertake this work, because they are exposed to quite a bit when we change what we're doing in our institutions. And I see we have Alex back if she wants to jump back.
Yes, I'm sorry. So I'm not privileged to have apparently a Wi-Fi that doesn't kick me out once in a while. So if I may ask what the question was, I'll jump right in.
Yes, of course. So I asked whether there was a particular part of your identity that you feel like really helped you in your museum work in a particular specific situation, or has really come up against something that a museum you were working with was trying to do and caused some friction.
Yeah, I think that what has helped me, I think what has always helped and or impeded has been my identity as a Latinx, and being of mixed ethnicity. I sometimes, like Sara says, you know, sometimes I can pass as something else. Mostly people think I'm not white. They usually think I'm Middle Eastern. But I do know that I've had certain privileges with that sort of question mark that people sometimes put once they get to see me. They don't always recognize where I'm coming from. So it has provided some opportunities for me to be able to use my voice on my platform to speak about other minority groups, you know, particularly Latinx, you know, and Black and Brown, to be in those conversations.
I'll answer the question as well. I think for me, the places where my identity bumps up against my work, or maybe informs my work the most, has been where I have felt uncomfortable, perhaps, and those kinds of experiences of feeling excluded from whatever it was, the site of exclusion, helped me to understand better. Just helped to raise my awareness of what I might need to then consider when I was doing work as, let's say, as an exhibit developer. So when I thought about, you know, what does it mean to be a disabled person coming to this exhibit, or what would it mean to be a queer person and not see your family reflected in the museum? Let's say when I worked at the Chicago Children's Museum. Those kinds of personal experiences help me to be much more aware of issues of equity and access and inclusion. Not perfectly, where I feel like I'm constantly learning, you know, as I get older, and it's, you know, it's kind of a lifetime thing to figure out how to incorporate the knowledge that you gain from life experience into the kind of more your professional settings, the work that you do. Maybe a couple of specific examples are that when I worked at Field Museum quite a long time ago, in the late 80s, early 90s, they did not yet have an LGBTQ like an employees group. And so I was part of a group of employees there at the museum that started that group at Field Museum. And at the time we were fighting for benefits, like health benefits for partners of employees, LGBTQ employees of the museum. And that group is still going. So I'm really pleased about that. You know, that's kind of a concrete reaction or manifestation of work that I did early on.
Thank you guys so much for opening up and sharing those experiences. So we're talking about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. So what do these words mean to you? Why do we need all of them? And where does DEAI overlap with social justice and anti-racism?
Okay, I'll jump in again. I think for me, the big umbrella is social justice. So a lot of the work that I've done in art education or museum settings or cultural work more broadly has focused on social justice. But within that, I think there are a number of areas that we need to be aware of. Like, I think racial justice is a part of what social justice has to be about, but it's not a given. Similarly, disability access or disability justice has to be a part of that, but it's not a given. So we have to break it down in more specific ways to look at the various manifestations of injustice, I think, or oppression and exclusion. So that's why I think it's important to have all those planks. What are we talking about? Equity specifically for me often has to do with the actual on the ground experience. Like what is it like to work in an institution where you're not even earning a living wage, as many people working in museums experience, especially when they just start in the field. So anyway, that's one answer to it.
I was just gonna say, I also think it's, DEAI task force, or to bring on a staff member to be working on DEAI has become very popular in the last few years, but I think just as much as it's also become very performative. And I think these terms are very important, and to have the breadth of them, because they really are different, as Therese said, to make sure that it is multi-inclusionary. But I really think that it also can't be something that's separated. My fear about the DEAI task force or the DEI team member is that then it sits in this isolated box and it's not incorporated into everybody's job description or every program and every exhibit that a museum does. And I think that's where the social justice umbrella helps, is that if that's baked into your institution's mission, then it does have to permeate every level of the institution. And I do think that is where some of the disconnect is with what we're seeing in a field that, a museum responds with the Black Lives Matter statement, says that they have a DEAI staff member, they've had them on board for 5-10 years, but that pushback that we're seeing from the general public or internally within the museum, where you have staff members saying, hey, that's not the reality of what's actually happening. So I do think these terms and their definitions are important, but it's also important to look at the actions and the actual work of what's happening.
To piggyback on what Therese and Sarah were saying, part of having the DEI, and even in my work in museums, I mean, it is the statement, like you said. Sometimes it's the statement, and it's just really not a deeper dive, because sometimes that could mean having that as a statement, it just means that everybody's welcome, all are welcome, therefore we treat everybody the same, and we're not always sitting back a little bit and reflecting on what that means for the organization. So then that's when I see like maybe that group, that committee may be able to highlight that, so that it is not just that performative statement, but really an accountability, a place for accountability for a group of people to come together to help ensure that we are reflecting internally about what it is that we're trying to do. How do we find the biases and stereotypes within our own organization? How do we stop them? Or how do we change them? How do we eliminate those barriers, those biases, those stereotypes? And that comes with a lot of self-reflection that can feel really uncomfortable to do so at the workplace. Because I know that for some museums, I know, some of the DEI means the actions might mean, let's do a program where everybody comes and celebrates whatever it is that we decided to celebrate, and we feel we've accomplished something. And we haven't had that opportunity to really sit back and say, but what does this really mean for an organization, for the behind the scenes, for the structure? And I think that's where it's not a one size fits all. When it comes to DEI, there's no one manual, do all of these 10 steps and you're going to be free of biases and stereotypes. If there is, please somebody put it on the chat box. We continually have to grow. It's almost what Therese said about having a group that came together to hold the museum accountable for that particular audience, LGBTQ audience. So I think that it is important for employees and from the different levels. I find myself working with this with my colleagues and from the middle level, up and down, the hierarchies. So I think that we can't discount the self-reflection that has to happen in order to know what it is that we're trying to, what are the barriers and the stereotypes that we're trying to address.
I want to say a quick response to Brooke's question, which I know she also put into the Q&A, but it's a really great question. So she's asking a question about committees within the museum, and I wanted to make a distinction about the group that I mentioned earlier, the queer group or the LGBT group. We formed that as like an extracurricular activity. It was not an officially sanctioned group that was part of the museum or that the museum itself organized. And I think that that was critical to its success, actually, because I will tell you that every institution I've ever worked on, I've served on the diversity committee. I've often been tapped to fill that position because I'm a gay person. And I find that those groups are useless, basically. I mean, everyone I've been on is just a useless thing. And it's there in that performative sense that Sarah was referring to. The institution formed the committee because it looked good to have that committee, or because there was a demand made on it to address issues of exclusion or lack of diversity. So they made a committee instead of actually putting resources into solving the problem by hiring people or by, you know, creating less oppressive situations. So I just resigned from one of those committees at the university where I work. I don't want to be part of those groups anymore, unless it's organized by the people at the institution, the actual workers, the people affected, not the institution qua institution, because in my experience, those are very bad scenarios.
How do you move the needle in an institution beyond performative actions to real actions? Let's say you're a front of house staff and you're not in a position of power in the institution. How do you move that needle? And how do you do that while also taking care of yourself and knowing that your time is valuable, and volunteering all your time for an institution isn't necessarily a viable option?
You need a union. You need to organize. Don't do it by yourself, because you'll get targeted and then you'll get fired. I mean, you really need to group together with other people. And you need to think about how power works at your specific institution, and then try to mobilize against that or around that, or you know, somehow to work with that.
And I think we're also seeing, and we saw it with the Museum Workers Speaks movement a few years ago as well, this crisis in leadership, because it is so hard for somebody, a frontline staff member or a new entry person, to be the one speaking up. But I also think it's also an issue where, especially in these DEAI committees, the work and this quote unquote authority is put on our BIPOC members or our LGBTQ members, and it's not their duty to teach. And I think we are finally hearing this. I think that's something that the Black Lives Matter movement has really brought to the fore, that it's not the duty of people who have been oppressed to teach our oppressors how to not oppress us. And I think that's also something that's really hard to balance as a BIPOC member or as an LGBTQ person, to not want to have your voice heard. But that's where leadership, they have to step up. I mean, they have to be the one. And I really feel that it really starts with an acknowledgement, and an institutions look back at the role they have played in perpetuating white supremacy and the role that they've played in oppressing people, making people feel uncomfortable. And until you have that acknowledgement, you know, I don't know that if your leadership is not willing to make that first step, I don't know that it's worth, as you said as well, somebody's time to put into the work. Because if the institution's not even willing to acknowledge their wrongs, how can they fix them?
Yeah, I do think that you're totally right about leadership having to have that buy-in, and that's why for me, I've seen, particularly in my work, has been that back and forth, you know, sort of push and pull. Because you also don't, you know, by so many more people in leadership realizing that change needs to happen, perhaps the change that needs to happen may not be the right one. So I would say, even if you don't have that committee or you don't have a group, because we don't want to put that emotional, you know, psychological and emotional labor on your Black and brown in your work, you still have to listen to them, because you also don't want to jump in with the, you know, a savior mentality. We recognize we're doing this, now we want to fix everything, but then your actions at the end of the day really didn't change. It just made you feel good about it. But so to me, there's always a middle ground, a back and forth of that power structure, and definitely making sure that you are still listening to the people that are affected the most.
One thing that any workplace could do, but I think very few of them do, is that they could just get rid of the category of at-will employee by giving all their workers a better contract. Even if they don't have a union, any workplace could give employees a contract that says, you are free to speak. We will always give you notice, or we will tell you what you're going to be fired for before you're going to be fired. It's the at-will employment factor for so many people that is seriously threatening. People are afraid to push or to rock the boat because they know that as an at-will employee, they have, virtually no protection. But that's something that's within the power of any institution to change simply by giving its employees a contract. And most of them just don't do that.
We've been talking about the challenges of an institution that maybe doesn't have the will from the top to change. Let's say you're at an institution that does, right? You have a really well-meaning leadership that is listening to people within the institution and does want to change, but doesn't necessarily know how and is making a lot of mistakes. How do you start? Like, how do you push them to be better?
Just form a racial justice committee or some other kind of committee on your own. And, you can do that as a place that coming together as employees or workers who want to talk to each other about those things, not because you're informing the institution, but because it's important to just have a space where you can speak to each other. And then you can, if you want, share that wisdom. I think with the institution. I mean, I think that's one way. I would also really recommend organizing a union. I mean, I said that once before, but I know it's not a perfect thing. I'm part of a union now, and it's definitely not a perfect thing. It's a lot of work to keep it going and to keep it democratic. But it is one way that workers do have some kind of rights in our country.
I also think there's so many tools out there. I think we're also hearing more and more, people are asking how and why. But if changing institutional racism was about education, we've already tried that. Like the materials are out there. So it's making that commitment, whether it's the Mass Action Toolkit or the Museums and Race Report Card, the Empathetic Museums Guidelines. There are the tools out there, but it's actually taking the time and the resources to actually implement them. And I think that's something, when these committees are formed, as Therese said, like to really put the resources behind them, and the time resource is really a huge thing. And to be transparent about that, if a museum shut down for a week and said, we really are going to be taking the staff time to do this, so there's going to be no programs this week. Our social media is going to be quiet this week. Not only helps show the commitment to the internal staff, but also communicates that intention and the transparency of the work to our audience, which also helps us train our audience with the expectations, because a lot of this work also relates to the public. And I think that's something that many institutions haven't done. They haven't devoted the actual time to do the work.
I think you hit on a huge aspect, which is time, because I think that this is work that has to be continually reflected upon and continually worked on. And unlike, if you're going to have that racial and ethnic lens, cultural lens to what you're doing and looking for the social justice moments, you have to go in with that notion and mentality that this is not like one size fits all. We're not going to fix everything and then your team is done and we never have to look at it because we're not perfect. It doesn't work that way. We have to we have to know that this is going to take time, that we are going to have to invest the time, and we have to ask our leadership to do so as well and hold them accountable. I think for us, the time commitment is the big one. And how do you make time? How do you make time at the workplace for these kind of things that maybe a lot of people are pushing back and thinking this does not belong in the workplace? I didn't come here for this, but it is, right? It does belong in, this conversation belongs in every kind of institution, every kind of place. So keeping that in mind, that you're in here for the long haul. It's not a, you know, and you have to take care of yourself, do the self-care that you need to do so that you can replenish your energies, and get back into the fight, because it is continually, whether you have a team or not, you know, you're always going to have this conversation. And if you're not reflecting on it, and looking at it from all these different ways, from the hiring to the programming that you're doing, you know, that's when the missteps happen as well. If you're not consciously looking at it always from that, you know, racial and cultural lens.
And I also wanted to follow up on that, Alex. I think that's a great point. And also the notion of that it is a continual process and it's not going to be perfect. I think so many institutions are afraid to try because they're afraid that they're going to put out the wrong statement or to make a misstep in this. But if you don't start the work, then you can't ever learn from your mistakes. And something that has been very helpful to me are there's 13 characteristics of white supremacy culture that are pinned up in all 3 of my offices. And one of them is perfectionism. And I think, you know, it goes back to that whole notion of we need new tools to do this work. And so we have to throw out those tools, and not fixate on those things. And also this notion of immediacy and we have to fix this now. No, this is a continual process, and we do have to take that to heart in ourselves and in our institution.
Yeah, that speaks to getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? And that also means having the courage to not stop the progress or stop the work, because, you know, there may be a few but loud voices that say, I don't like this. And, you know, then you have your, you know, maybe complicit bias, you know, well, one person said, or a few people said this. Meanwhile, you have a whole group, you know, the world is telling you, you really need to look at this and really need to reflect.
In an institution that is having these conversations, recognizing that it is an ongoing process to have these conversations, how do we help the institution approach these conversations from a point of view of abundance? And why is that important?
I think some of the, and we've been hearing this about an abundance lens, and I love this terminology and this thought process, because we hear so much about people being afraid, and that's what some of the, whether they're violent or on social media pushback that we're getting from people who feel like they have to lose something in order for us to have equity in our country, which doesn't have to be. I think one of the big issues, and this came up on one of the museum groups on Facebook, about, well, how can we hire more people? You know, how can we diversify our staff, which if our staff is so small anyhow. But I think not looking at it from that scarcity standpoint, but we are all underfunded and understaffed. So maybe making our institutions more socially justice minded means that we expand our staff so that even the most privileged person in our institution isn't working 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. And I think that also goes to Therese's statements about unions. And I think that's a bigger discussion that our field needs to have. So if we don't think about, and I'm from a very small museum, we run on a $90,000 a year budget, but if we aren't looking at how are we being limited, but what are our potentials, then we can look at these things without being afraid of losing our jobs or losing our position or losing our power. And that we really have to look at this as there's an abundance. We just have to push and make that abundance, you know, available.
Yeah, I love that. And it makes me also think about a couple other things related to remembering that we actually live amidst abundance, but we're constantly told in many of our institutions, not just museums, the university, you know, all of education, you know, K through higher ed, we're told that we're just broke constantly. There, you know, there's not money for anything. It's that austerity kind of mentality, and that is actually a political movement. We're suffering from this political movement that was put into place, you know, decades ago by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and we're still kind of feeling the results of that. And we have to continuously push back and remind ourselves that there is abundance. but the resources are being taken by a few, well, the many suffer. And so when the university tells us that we're broke, we just say, but what about that $1 million makeover that the president's office just got? Or what about the $31 million mansion the president lives in? You know, there's money out there. It's just not being given to the many of us. And so, and related to that, I think it's also important to remember that while we may work in one location, we might work in museums, or we might work in higher education like I do now, but we are connected to all of this, the larger issues of the economy and politics. And again, museums are not neutral, and we're connected to all of this. So when people say, oh, museums, you know, there's just no jobs in museums, or as Sarah's saying, we're all doing 2 or 3 or 4 jobs. That's true in the university. It's true, you know, at McDonald's. It's true in the museum. We're all being expected to work much more. We're all feeling much more precarious in our places of employment. It's a political movement that we're suffering from. So it's not just hitting museums, it's hitting all these workplaces. And we have to, I think, keep that bigger picture and, you know, stay involved and aware politically as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that if you look at it from an abundance perspective, then you won't put those mental limitations, because I think some of it could be mental limitations, you know, when we're thinking about how do you diversify your hiring practices, for example. And, you know, if you continually only get a specific group, you know, specific community coming and say, well, nobody wants this job, we know that that's not going to work. You're going to have to think differently. There's other places that you can go and promote the jobs that are available. There has to be a willingness to try something different. And like you said, Sarah and Therese, and make those mistakes, you know, if you will. But you have to have that courage to look at things. We have the resources. We just have to look at it from a different perspective. That's probably the hardest part, is probably changing the mindset that we have already set about how things need to work, how a museum structure is. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles, is continually reflecting and really trying to change that mindset to take those courageous baby steps, you know, having the courageous conversations, having really clear, transparent communication at your workplace, and be okay with people that are going to disagree with you.
So I have one more question before we turn over to Q&A. We are the Chicago Museum Exhibitors Group, so I want to turn the lens a little bit on exhibits. I've found in my own experience that there are a lot of exhibits that have diverse content. So they are talking about lots of different kinds of people, but they are not necessarily diverse, accessible, equitable, or inclusive in ways beyond the content. What can we do about that?
Can you say a little bit more, Isabel, about what you mean not beyond the content? Just another example.
So you could have an exhibit about the history of the Black Panthers on the South Side, but you don't have anyone that was involved in that movement in the development team. They're not consulted beyond conducting maybe some oral history interviews, processes like that. How do we bring the community into the process of creating an exhibit about them?
Great, thanks. I'll add one, or have one response to that. I think Sarah mentioned the Mass Action Toolkit, and one of the things that's included in the toolkit is an emphasis on institutions needing to do an internal assessment. I mean, that's, you know, that's the whole toolkit in some ways. So looking at their own kinds of structures, like what's the power sharing like? How are we operating as an institution? Are we inclusive of, you know, do we give credit where credit is due? Do we, what's our pay structure like? All those kinds of internal questions I think would be helpful, and maybe the toolkit would be one place to look at. I agree with you. I think that's a problem that many museums have.
And I also think some of it is sharing the authority. You know, we as museums really love to say, and there's how many studies out there that we probably all use when we're looking for funding, about how the general public sees us as, you know, these trusted sources of information. And I think we rely on that too much, and that's also become some of our institutional culture, that we are the ones presenting, but we have to share that voice and that authority. I think it was Kelly Morgan in a discussion last week talked about, we hear so much about we're going to empower Black and Brown voices. No, let's not empower them. Let's give them the space for their own voices to be present. And I think some of that from a small museum, and this is why I'm such a small museum advocate, I plan an exhibit maybe a year out, maybe. But some of our large institutions are planning exhibits 3, 4, 5 years out, and there's no way to be responsive to what's happening in the world. I think we saw that this year with the COVID and the racial injustices that were really put on display by the horrible miscarriage of justice with George Floyd, and with the decision yesterday with Breonna Taylor. And how, when you have an exhibit that doesn't even have those things in our purview, of course it's going to feel a little tone deaf at times. And I think, really engaging the community in all aspects, especially if your exhibit is talking about them, and sharing that voice and sharing that power helps get around that. But it also means that our processes in museums completely change, and that's also a much harder thing to do.
I'll add one thing to that too. I think to remember that what we do here in the US is not the only way that museums can be organized or can function. And so it's important when we think about what's the history that I'm involved with when I am developing an exhibit, like what's my lineage that I'm tapping into. I think it's important to look outside. There are wonderful projects being done in, let's say, Brazil, the favela museums that are, they don't collect. They are organized around a stage and a courtyard and a kitchen and a workshop, and they are not involved in bringing in collections or keeping anything, but they host activities that are intended to honor cultural memory. So that's just one model. And there are other models out there that we can look to, eco-museums in Mexico, or, there's just a number of models. They're not all organized in the way that we are used to organizing things, where there's a curator who calls the shots and makes more money than everybody and has the good ideas or the one idea, and then all the rest of us who scurry around to execute that idea. That's just one model, not a very good one, and we should resist that model.
Yeah, I think you're right, Theresa. I think you hit on a point about the curator being, the one expert of all. And I think that speaks to how the structures need to change. Like who holds the expertise? And is it really just someone with a degree that has spent the time and have had the privilege maybe to have spent that time and then speak for someone else? Or do we change the way that we think about exhibits and we diversify in itself the structure? Who's coming to the table to make this happen, whatever that it is, whatever exhibit, what does your cross-departmental work look like, break up the structure that we see always happening, and get other experts around the table, so that you can hear those other voices, whether or not they have a degree in that particular aspect.
So right now we're talking about how to change processes in museums so that the community, whatever community is involved in the process of making an exhibit about that community. But a great way to get people involved in a museum is to hire them as staff. Something that Katie Slavovsky has pointed out is that our institutions, particularly now, are run by primarily white leaders, and BIPOC people have been disproportionately affected by layoffs in museums. And so how do we deal with that? Tracy Marks-Seglin is asking, can you speak to effective strategies for diversifying leadership, staff, and board? How do we build those pipelines in ways that actually result in more diverse leadership and more diverse boards?
This is a really hard one. I will say, and I know Therese I've heard her talk many times about finding better candidates and where are you posting your job, but how much are you paying for those jobs? And are you posting that what your job, which I think we are finally getting better about posting salaries and job descriptions. But I do want to speak to the board diversification. So I have been working on this since the minute I got to West Chicago. And it has taken me 14 years for us to first have our first person of color on our board, a Mexican woman in a half Mexican community. It's outrageous. But I think some of it is also the support systems and the support networks. So for those of you who maybe have attended your institution's board meeting one time and sat in, they are intimidating spaces, and they are set up to be that. They are places of power, and they are set up to distinctly state that they're the decision makers versus the others. Even things such as Robert's Rules of Law, which I am recovering an attorney, those type of things are structures, are political structures that are set up to really cut those institutional barriers. And if your institution isn't committed to this work and doesn't have support structures for someone coming into there to, whether it's training or, really just providing people an outlet to walk out of maybe a really tense board meeting or one that's very procedural and be like, what was that? I think if we're not providing those things when BIPOC people enter our spaces or enter the board space, they're so turned off. And I think that's the same for staff as well. When there isn't the comfort level and they're going to have to do this emotional labor, is that where they want to be? Our equity, for anybody on this call who is a BIPOC, identifies as BIPOC, our equity has an amazing training about working in predominantly white institutions and how to survive that. And it is an amazing experience of the language that we can all be using to empower ourselves, but also the realities that people face. And I think we have to also reflect on what kind of a space are we inviting people into when we try to, quote unquote, diversify our spaces.
I just put a link to a great short little video by an artist collective that works under the name Pinkie Show. And this little video has a phrase in it where they're talking about boards, and they say something about how when they first started going to museums, they thought there must be some kind of rule against having poor people on the board, but then they found out it's not a rule, it's just what museums like to do. And so enjoy that. It's a little gift for you all. It's pretty funny, but also accurate. And I think we could really think differently about who we include in these in the boards and the leadership. But it also brings up the issue of funding. If board members are all expected to be rich so that they can fund these institutions, then obviously that's going to exclude a whole lot of people. So we do, I think, need to start to think differently about how we make demands on our governments to adequately fund the public sector, which we used to fund, and then we had Reagan. And that was the beginning of the end.
So we have a question from Zoe Albion. Justice work can feel overwhelming and insurmountable, and this can be amplified when institutions act performatively, for example, by hosting task forces or making statements that don't actually create change. Movements have seen success when there are concrete demands and goals. What are some of the concrete goals that museums, appropriately scaled, can work towards? One that I think has been mentioned is unions. Are there any others that you feel like are really important concrete goals for people to hold in their minds?
A living wage. This should not be hard. A living wage. Yeah, that's one of my.
I think that when it says demands and goals, part of this work needs to be built into your annual plans, needs to be places where you can actually measure some of the work. What do you expect? Set those intentions early. Like, what is it that we want to see done different? What we're going to provide the staff? Put it in writing. That way, if it's in writing, you can hold your place of work accountable to it. You will also have measures that you can say, okay, this was really truly our impact. and make sure that it is the right kind of impact, you know. We want to make sure that we're looking at intentions versus impact, but really put it in writing and put it in a way that it holds you accountable, you know, as a staff member, but it also holds the whole organization accountable. And those are the kind of things that the board will also have to look at, you know, what is the goals, what is the board's annual plan for themselves? You know, it's almost like a 360, you know, we always get evaluated, you know, leadership down. Implement something where we can, you know, do a 360. Let's, you know, review from the bottom up as well. You know, look at, I mean, unfortunately, our spaces are hierarchical. There are structures. Those are going to be hard to change, but we do need to start thinking about how can we also hold our leadership accountable. And some of that is really having, you know, places where we can look at, we can see what we said we were going to do. Are we doing it? And if we're not doing it, why? And what needs to change?
Yeah, no, I love all of that. And I'll just add one thing, that the structures are hierarchical because institutions like that, they can also change that. They can work more laterally.
And I think we also have to look to our associations or stop paying dues. So if your association is paying dues, if your institution is paying dues into an association that doesn't include this work in their accreditation processes, then there's no weight behind the work for our field. And I think that's something that we also have to demand of our institutions, but also of our associations.
And I would add that it might also come with making, again, this comes with making sacrifices, right? You're going to have to sacrifice the power that you are holding to be able to do exactly what Therese is suggesting, which is what you want to do, you know, less bottom up, you know, more of a collective and more of an equal plane. But I know, for example, in the past, like the National Museum of Mexican Fine Arts, they used to work with organizations. They wanted to make sure that the organizations had a certain amount of Latinx on their board. So does our institutions have that? You know, do we say, okay, our board needs to be comprised of a percentage of BIPOC? And if not, then that's a good measure of like, okay, if you're not even having that as a point of measure, again, the measures that you want to make sure you're meeting, if you don't even have that, you know, that expectation, you're just going after the money, then you're not going to have more voices at the table. So you really need to start changing and putting those measure. A percentage of people need to be in these teams, a percentage of people need to be on the board, and make sure that the people that you are bringing, they're not just tokens, but that they're still, you know, bought into the structures that we already have in society, but that they're really going to come with that racial, social justice lens to work with you. So that's one thing I would add.
Well, thank you all so much for your time. I know that we just have 2 minutes left. So first of all, I want to say that I hope that we'll be able to continue this conversation in the CMEG committee and think about concrete things that we can do as this kind of loose volunteer group of people that comes together to talk about museums and exhibits. So I would love for you guys to join me in that. And then I just want to give the three speakers a moment to say any closing words they might have. So I'll hand it back to you guys.
Well, I just was looking at the questions and I see a question or a request that we acknowledge the verdict that came in around Breonna Taylor yesterday, and Sara did, and I want to also echo that and just say that the time is long past for us to, you know, as institutions and all our communities, to just express our outrage and to really just shut down until there's justice, not just for Breonna Taylor, but for the so many others that have been killed by police in our nation, people of color who have been killed by police. And I guess I'll just add by saying that I think we ought to defund the police and put more money into our cultural institutions.
And I think another question that I would like to highlight with this is the self-care aspect, which many of us are not good at because we feel, and I am very, very bad at, But we are facing so many different pandemics right now, whether it's coronavirus or the racial injustices that we are seeing and that are being played out, the amount of racism, but also, and I heard this in a talk this week about the pandemic of hope, and that we also, many of us feel completely hopeless. So, you know, to leave anybody who's struggling with this work is to also find your area of hope, whether it's your children or nature or, you know, playing video games, whatever it is that allows you some outlet, I think is something that, you know, we all need to fuel ourselves for this work and for this fight, because it really, we really need it.
And I think I would add being there for each other, having these kind of conversations. This is an incredible honor to be able to hear from others. It's also incredibly humbling to see all of the questions in the chat and in the question box, because it proves that we're not alone. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of how do we do this work, but it gives me hope that we're not alone in this, that we can take advantage of our presence here, whatever privileges or powers we may have, you know, whether it's much or little, and put them towards that, you know, the lens of change. So I'm sort of measuring my hopelessness with the hope, because I'm surrounded by all of you good people trying to do this work.
Well, thank you all, and I think we'll close up. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.